Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on a very special ASMR adventure where we travel back in time together and take a tour around a spectacular and sumptuous Tudor event, the Field of the Cloth of Gold. This lavish occasion was a peace summit held between two kings, and it ran from the 7th of June to the 24th of June, 1520. The two kings, Henry VIII of England and Francois I of France, met in a valley not far from the town of Calais, and for the duration of their visit there, the area was transformed into a splendid spectacle, with an extravagant temporary palace, a full-size jousting ring, and hundreds of tents and pavilions that turned the fields into a sea of fluttering multicoloured pennants and dazzling cloth of gold decorations. For a full 2.5 weeks, there was a constant round of jousting, feasting, revelries and masques, as the two kings showed off their magnificence to each other and filled the Pale of Calais with a host of glittering wonders. So, in this talk, we're going to time travel in our imaginations so that I can guide you around this amazing event and show you just some of the many marvellous sights that were to be seen there. As usual, there'll be some images on the video to accompany our tour, but there's no need for you to look at them if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you as we venture back 500 years to June 1520 and find ourselves able to invisibly wander around and explore this remarkable occasion. So, welcome to the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Let's begin by becoming unseen witnesses to the events that are taking place on June the 7th, on the very first day of the summit. We find ourselves outside a vast and imposing stone castle, which is surrounded by a moat and features heavily fortified battlements. This is the castle of Guines, where the English king Henry VIII, his wife Katherine of Aragon, and the noblest part of the king's vast retinue have been staying for the past few days. The town of Guines is located just to the south of the port of Calais, in what, in the 21st century, is the northeast corner of France. However, right now, in 1520, Guines is a British territory in what is known as the Pale of Calais, a small region of northeastern French coast that has technically belonged to Britain since its capture at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. It's here that Henry VIII and Francois I have chosen to meet, to celebrate a peace treaty that was drawn up between the two countries back in 1518. Henry has travelled with his entire court from London, through Kent and across the narrow sea of the English Channel, and Francois has travelled from his court at Fontainebleau and is staying with his own equally large retinue at Ardres, a neighbouring castle that's just over the border in France. As the morning of the 7th of June dawns, let's join the English retinue as they make their way from the castle at Guines and proceed on horseback to the soft, grassy valley where the two kings will meet. Guines Castle has been bustling and busy since dawn, as grooms go to work, brushing the coats and polishing the harnesses of hundreds of noble horses, while upstairs in the castle, an army of servants rushes around to ensure that boots are polished, caps are brushed, and shirts, doublets, gowns, and chains of office are laid out in spotless readiness for the royals and nobles who will wear them today. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the English procession is ready to depart, and the cannons on the battlements of Guisnes Castle fire to signal the start of this grand ceremonial march. Musicians strike up on their drums, pipes and trumpets to accompany the enormous English entourage as it sets out on its way to meet the equally large French company that will be setting off at the same time. The English procession is an extravaganza of pomp and finery, decked with fluttering coloured banners, heraldic standards, and lords dressed in their most sumptuous attire. However, even though this event is a celebration of peace, Henry is still keen to show off his military prowess, and prominently placed near the front of his train are 100 English archers who are notorious for the deadly accuracy of their shooting, and who have been responsible for several French defeats in the past. The archers are followed by a multitude of guards, and then the gentlemen of the royal household, the noblemen that make up Henry's personal retinue, and who are dressed resplendently in cloths of gold and silver, embroidered velvets and opulent silks. There are 12 trumpeters, 12 heralds, and 12 mace-bearers who carry their imposing spiked weapons over their shoulders as they ride forward on their horses. Then comes the party of the king himself, headed by the Marquis of Dorset, who is charged with the tricky proposition of staying upright on his horse, whilst bearing aloft the large and heavy sword of state. Riding behind him is the king himself, flanked by his Lord High Chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey. It's Wolsey who has worked so hard to arrange this peace summit, as a way of bringing together those two previously implacable enemies, England and France. And as he rides in triumph at the king's side, dressed in gorgeous robes of crimson satin, we might perhaps be able to see the hint of a gratified smile on Wolsey's face at the sight of all his hard work and diplomacy having finally come to spectacular fruition. The king himself maintains a stern and dignified expression as he rides forward on his handsome, high-stepping courser, which is dressed for the occasion in a trapper or coat, woven out of fine-spun gold and decorated with classical figures from ancient Rome. Above this gleaming golden horse, Henry is equally glittering, dressed in a tunic made from silver brocade, with sleeves that are slashed with cloth of gold, and studded with great rubies, emeralds, diamonds and pearls. Over this, Henry sports a mantle or cloak, also made of cloth of gold, which makes him appear to dazzle as brightly as the sun. Behind the monarch, more richly dressed lords and gentlemen ride on horseback, as well as a company of bishops, ambassadors, armed guards and infantrymen. It's said that there are at least 4,000 people taking part in this procession, and as they stream past us, we find ourselves blinking in amazement at the sight of so many horses, so many soldiers, so many knights and retainers bearing shining arms, golden crucifixes, jewel-encrusted swords, and all the other ceremonial trappings of magnificence that make up the royal court of England. But as we are swept along by this mighty cavalcade, let's take a moment to look up and admire an extraordinary building that will pass on our way. An enormous gleaming palace, adorned with hundreds of gilded decorations and sparkling stained glass windows. Unlike Guisnes Castle, this isn't a solid stone structure, but rather a temporary palace that Henry VIII has had specially built for the summit. For the past 2 months, hundreds of joiners, carpenters, and craftsmen who have been specially shipped over from England have been working night and day to create this wondrous 2-story building. And as we see it rise up above the sea of colourful, striped and patterned tents that surround it, we might find we have a sudden urge to quietly drop out of the procession and steal an opportunity to explore this astonishing and beautiful place. Don't worry, we'll come back to the palace and do that exploring later on. But right now there's no time to linger, because as the English procession continues to march forward, the cannons of Guisnes Castle begin to fire again. And in the distance, a far-off boom indicates that the cannons at Ardres are firing likewise. This is the signal that the 2 processions are about to meet, and as we continue onward, we see the head of the French procession coming into view directly before us. Not to be outdone by Henry, Francois I's cavalcade is just as huge, just as colourful, and just as splendid as his English counterparts. Like Henry, he's also magnificently attired in cloth of silver and gold, with a sumptuous cloak set with pearls and precious stones. Both monarchs are wearing jewelled black velvet caps upon their heads, and when the 2 processions finally reach each other, the kings are both supposed to doff their hats, because the only man a king should ever take his hat off for is another king. Nevertheless, as these 2 mighty nations finally come face to face, we can feel a tingle of nervous tension in the air. France and England have such a complex and bloody history of war, and although this summit is the result of a treaty, 2 years of peace doesn't seem that long after centuries of enmity. Amongst the thousands of people who are gathered here on both sides are many soldiers who are more used to fighting battles than attending diplomatic conferences. And as the 2 nations step even closer, we might perhaps overhear one of the Venetian ambassadors whisper to his neighbour that Francois nearly called the whole thing off when he saw just how many deadly English archers Henry had brought with him in his train. Suspicion lurks on both sides, and as the French and English finally meet and halt just a few short paces from each other, silence suddenly floods the valley. The musicians cease their playing, and all that we can hear now is the stamp of horses' hooves, the occasional jingle of a harness, and the extraordinary sound of thousands of people and beasts breathing, waiting, silently sizing each other up as the 2 great monarchs regard each other for the very first time in their lives. These are both young kings. Henry is only 29 years old, and Francis is just 25. Both are tall, strong, and handsome, active young men who are fond of jousting and hunting, and perhaps a small part of each of them is also yearning for a battle. But no, although they're both eager to display their power and dominance to the other, these 2 rulers are also wise enough to heed the advice of their counsellors, and honourable enough not to go back on their promises. So it is that each of them rides forward, breaking from the ranks of their supporters, to meet each other king to king. And as they advance towards each other, both kings sweep their caps from their heads in a salute of friendly recognition, and a huge cheer goes up that echoes on and on across the valley. Then the 2 kings dismount from their steeds and embrace each other, and as their gentlemen attendants and counsellors surge forward to assist them, the two royal parties unite and follow their monarchs into a large and magnificent golden pavilion, where the talks will begin that will hopefully cement peace and goodwill between these two proud nations. The field of the cloth of gold has started, and as the kings disappear inside the pavilion, the thousands who remain outside appear to sigh a vast, collective breath out. The event is being held on English soil, so it's the responsibility of the English to be gracious hosts. And so as the first hesitant chats start up between the French and English parties, a delicious, warming scent suddenly wafts over to our noses. A moment later, through the parting crowds, we see a small army of pages and servants arriving with trays of refreshments. There are spiced cakes to eat and bowls of hippocras to drink. Hippocras is a delicious concoction made from wine, sweetened with sugar and spices, and served warm. As the bowls of it are passed around and imbibed, the mood begins to loosen. The tension between the two sides finally ebbs away, and everyone is ready to enjoy themselves. So while the French and English begin to relax and mingle, let's you and I take the opportunity to sneak up closer to the pavilion where Henry and Francois are meeting. This huge tent is held up by several masts, with the tallest central one topped with a pinnacle that's finished with a carved and gilded figure of Saint Michael. Like most of the tents, the main body of the pavilion is made from linen canvas, but it's been entirely covered on the outside with cloth of gold. Cloth of gold is such a rare and precious fabric. It isn't often that an ordinary person gets a chance to look at it up close. So let's take a look now and admire this dazzling fabric. It derives its name from the fact that it's woven from threads that have been individually wrapped in a thin layer of real gold, so that the finished cloth glows and gleams. Unsurprisingly, it's an incredibly expensive fabric and takes a long time to create, so the weavers of Italy who specialize in its production have been working non-stop this year to create enough of the amazing fabric for this event. Usually it's only worn by kings or emperors. Even the greatest nobles are only allowed to use it occasionally as a small trim or decoration. But here at this summit, it is everywhere. Never has so much cloth of gold ever been seen in one place. And as we put out our hands and tentatively touch the edge of the tent, we can feel the cool weave of the gold threads and the heavy weight of the fabric, which makes the whole pavilion look as though it were sheathed in liquid gold. At the entrance to the pavilion, we can also see that the inside is as richly decorated as the outside, hung as it is with cloths of midnight blue velvet that are embroidered all over with golden fleur-de-lis. The surrounding smaller tents that make up the rest of the encampment are also opulently decorated with coloured velvets, damasks, and silks, dyed and patterned with curious and delightful designs, and also trimmed with cloths of gold and silver. All this rich pageantry is a deliberate ploy to show the grandeur of both the English and French courts. And as neither side wants to be eclipsed by the other, both nations have gone out of their way to create a dazzling effect that overcomes our senses with its sheer splendor. Once we've finished admiring the tents, let's use our time-traveling abilities to magically jump forward a few days and explore a different aspect of this festival of peace. Starting on Monday, the 11th of June, Francois and Henry are hosting a mighty tournament of jousting and combat, and a special list field, or combat arena, has been set up so that both royal and noble competitors can meet in chivalrous feats of arms. On one side of the list field, a richly decorated viewing pavilion has been erected, so that the kings and queens of England and France can sit next to each other and watch the tournament in luxury. However, Henry and Francois are not content to be just mere spectators. They are also both entering the lists themselves and acting as joint captains in the same team, so that, in the unlikely event of a defeat, neither king will suffer the indignity of having been beaten by his rival. The joint king's team consists of 16 men, 8 French and 8 English, all of whom are of noble or royal descent, and all of whom are highly skilled in the tilt yard. Collectively, they are known as the challengers, and they will take on the all-comers, which is to say any of the other lords, knights or gentlemen who want to show their prowess in the field. The all-comers indicate their wish to participate in the tournament by riding over to a great artificial tree that has been set up next to the list field. Known as the Tree of Honour, it's another sumptuous spectacle, trimmed with leaves made of green damask and hung all over with banners of cloth of gold and silver. Hanging in the tree, 2 large shields represent the arms of England and France, while 3 more shields are mounted below them to represent the 3 different fields of tournament combat. The all-comers who wish to participate must ride forward and touch one of these shields with their lances. There's a grey and black shield to represent the tilt, which is the contest in which 2 individual combatants joust on horseback on either side of the tilt fence. A second shield, decorated in shades of gold and tawny brown, represents the tourney, where multiple combatants fight on horseback across an open field, while a third shield decorated in silver has been assigned to the foot combat, which again takes place between 2 individual men across the tilt fence. On the first day of the tournament, both Henry and Francois are competing in the tilt, and both are gorgeously arrayed in their jousting costumes. The English king is clad in rich, russet-coloured velvet, decorated all over with waves of gold damask to signify his dominion over the seas, while Francois I and his horse are both bedecked with symbols of books, birds, and mottos to show the French king's dedication to the virtues of chivalry. Both monarchs will joust on multiple occasions over the next 2 weeks, and at one point, much to everyone's consternation, Francois is wounded in the side of the head. But it turns out to be only a superficial scratch, and the king is soon ready to return to his horse once again. Meanwhile, the 2 queens, Claude and Catherine, remain sitting in their viewing pavilion and preside over the ceremonies of chivalry and form that take place every day, and sometimes even between every round of combat. Both queens are serene and elegant in their gracious acknowledgement of the men who compete for their favour. But with a full week of daily jousts, tourneys and sword fights to sit through, one has to hope that Claude and Catherine are both fond of watching combat sports. Otherwise, their minds might begin to wander. As the tournament continues, to the cheers and applause of the spectating crowds, let's leave the list field and make our way back to that dazzling sight that we first noticed on our way into the valley, Henry VIII's temporary palace. As I mentioned before, this remarkable structure has been built especially for the Field of the Cloth of Gold summit, and it stands close to the castle at Guines, with a covered walkway connecting the 2 buildings, so that the English royal party can move with ease between them without being exposed to the elements. Even though this is a temporary building that will be occupied for less than 3 weeks, the palace is the size of a permanent castle. It stands more than 100 meters, or 300 feet, in length, which is larger than the palace Cardinal Wolsey has built for himself at Hampton Court. The palace has 2 floors, with offices and service rooms on the ground floor, and royal apartments on the first floor. Stone foundations have been laid to support the structure, and above them a 2-meter-high brick wall has been built to give the palace a solid base. Tall, round turrets of brick have also been added to each of the 4 corners of the building, and also on either side of the large and impressive entrance gate. However, between the turrets, the main walls of the palace have actually been made of wood, which is painted to look like stone. There are crenellated timber battlements running around the top of the palace walls, and these are decorated with statues of kings and giant heraldic beasts, all carved out of wood, but again painted to look like stone. Finally, to complete the illusion, there's a huge canvas roof topping the building, which has again been decorated, this time in order to mimic the effect of hundreds of grey roof slates. As we bring our eyes back down from the roof and regard the arched entrance gate of the palace, we'll see that it's crowned with an impressive scalloped portico, mounted with a large royal coat of arms, painted in brilliant colours. However, we'll also notice that there seem to be rather a lot of people loitering about outside the entrance gate, and that not all of them appear to be entirely sober. The cause of this quickly becomes apparent. Immediately in front of the gate, 2 ornate fountains have been built, dressed with gilded decorations and gilded inscriptions that read, "Fais bon cher qui voudra," feast well, whoever wants to. One of the fountains is topped with a gilded figure of Bacchus, and the other similarly topped with a golden figure of Cupid, and one is spurting jets of claret wine, while the other is dispensing Malmsey, a sweet white wine from the southern Mediterranean. These 2 fountains have been set up to signify the generosity and goodwill of Henry VIII, and according to his orders, the fountains of wine run day and night, which explains the merry gathering of people clustered around the entrance to the palace, and also explains why 1 or 2 of them appear to be passed out on the ground. Let's move past these intoxicating fountains and walk through the main gate of the palace so that we can take a peek inside this marvellous royal edifice. Beyond the arch, we find ourselves in a large and gracious inner courtyard, which is surrounded on all sides with tall bay windows. Each one of them has been glazed with hand-blown Flemish glass, which is known for its clarity and crystalline qualities, and each is also decorated with beautiful panels of coloured stained glass and set into a gilded window frame. The sight of all these windows, so much glass, so much colour, and so much gilded decoration, has made the visiting French nobles declare that Henry's palace is the 8th wonder of the world, and they refer to it as the Crystal Palace. On the opposite side of the courtyard is the entrance to the palace interior, so let's pass through into a richly decorated hallway and climb up a handsome double wooden staircase that has shallow, broad steps to make it easy for the noble ladies of the court to ascend to the first floor in their long, sweeping gowns. At the top of the stairs, we'll find ourselves in the Great Chamber, a vast room that runs down the entire length of the palace and which has been divided into sections with canvas walls, painted once again to look like stone. We see that the high canvas roof, that's painted on the outside to mimic slates, has been canopied on the inside with billowing white silk, decorated all over with gold embroidery in a diamond pattern studded with Tudor roses. Beneath this opulent ceiling, every inch of the walls is draped in cloth of gold and hung with sumptuous tapestries. These tapestries are known as cloths of Arras because they're specially woven in the Arras region of northern France. The Arras hangings light up the room with their luminous colours and interwoven golden threads, so that during the day the tapestries gleam by the light from the many tall windows, and at night they shine by the light of hundreds of candles. The chairs that furnish the chamber are also upholstered in magnificent gold tapestry work and are furnished with heavily embroidered plump silken cushions, while beneath our feet the wooden floors are entirely covered with soft and heavy Turkish carpets. The breathtaking luxury of this great chamber is repeated in the rest of the apartments that we'll find in the palace. There's a royal chapel, splendidly furnished with silks, tapestries, and cloths of gold, with a carved golden altar decorated with gilded images of the apostles, and an elaborately carved and decorated organ, which has been especially installed to accompany each of the sung masses that are held in the chapel. On the other side of the palace are equally sumptuous accommodations for Cardinal Wolsey and Mary Tudor, who these days is the Dowager Queen of France, but who also happens to be Henry VIII's younger sister. Further sets of lavishly decorated chambers are individually dedicated to the King and the Queen, who are sleeping at Guisnes Castle, but using the temporary palace as a banqueting house, where they host spectacular feasts. Interestingly, when these feasts occur, Henry and Francois are unable to attend them together, because protocol dictates that a king should always be the sole, highest-ranking member at any dinner. So to avoid a transgression of etiquette, Henry rides over to the French camp to be graciously hosted by Claude, the Queen of France, while Francois comes over to this glittering palace to be hosted by Henry's queen, Katherine of Aragon. Of course, as time travellers from the future, we already know that, in another 10 years' time, Katherine and her royal husband will be estranged, and Henry will be famously plotting to seek an annulment of his marriage in order to wed Anne Boleyn. However, right now, all of that is for the future, and at the moment, the King and Queen of England seem comfortably settled in their 11-year marriage. Whatever might be happening behind the scenes, Queen Katherine certainly looks poised and radiant as she accompanies Francois to his seat of honour and presides over the feasts, revels, and entertainments that showcase all the glorious extravagance that the English court has to offer. Why don't we fly forward in time again and witness for ourselves one of those extravagant feasts where Katherine is hosting the King of France? The individual sections of the great chamber are hosting different companies of the feast, with one section set out with tables for 134 ladies of the court, and another furnished for around 200 gentlemen. Beyond this, in the Queen's presence chamber, Katherine hosts Francois himself, as well as other members of the French royal court, and a choice selection of the most powerful English nobles. Katherine and Francois sit under a cloth of estate, which is a type of tapestried canopy, of the sort you often see in paintings, hanging above a royal throne. This particular cloth of estate is heavily embroidered with leaves and patterns of foliage to create the delightful sensation of dining in a fabric forest. And as Catherine and Francois converse beneath it, 3 courses are served on plates and dishes of solid gold. However, while 3 courses might sound like a familiar pattern to us for a formal dinner, the meal itself is not quite perhaps as we expected it, because each course contains over 50 dishes. As servants busy about the chamber with great serving platters of food, the scents of roasted meats fill the air, and we might recognize some of the dishes, which include game pies, racks of lamb, sides of beef, and great haunches of venison. However, other dishes might not be quite so familiar, as at one point, a whole dolphin is served up on a gilded platter, while roasted swans and peacocks are dressed in their own feathers and served up with their beaks painted gold to create a theatrical table centerpiece. Then, at the end of each course, the table is set with a subtlety, which is a sweet decoration made of sugar or marchpane, which is the Tudor forerunner of marzipan. These subtleties are formed into all kinds of ingenious shapes, including angels, prophets, and kings, as well as heraldic beasts such as salamanders, leopards, ermines, and lions. Other sweet dishes include gilded apples and walnuts, jellies, gingerbreads, and candied oranges, while to quench the thirst of the many guests, elegant Venetian glassware is filled with German, Greek, and French wines, all of which are consumed in great quantities. At the royal end of the table, conversation, of course, remains gracious and formal. But as the wine flows, we might hear some interesting snippets of gossip down at the other end of the table, where one ambassador might whisper to another that a few days ago, King Francois paid a surprise morning visit to Henry at Guines Castle. Or across the table, a bishop tuts to a duke that he has heard upon the grapevine that Henry actually challenged Francois to a spontaneous wrestling match, and lost. As the guests continue to chatter over their meal, a banquet is finally brought out, which is a sweet course of biscuits, wafers, and fruit tarts, designed to round off the feast. It's also a polite signal to the guests from the lower echelons that it's time for them to leave the palace. Music strikes up, and the royals and nobles stand in preparation for the dance. King Francois is said to be a skilled and enthusiastic dancer, and as the musicians play on their flutes, viols, and drums, he takes a turn with several ladies from the English court, acquitting himself with grace and spirit in both the slower formal dances, such as the stately pavane, and in the more lively, high-stepping dances like the saltarello, which Francois seems to enjoy very much indeed. Then, at the end of the evening, the company is entertained by a masque, a lavish courtly entertainment that combines singing, dancing, and acting, and in which elaborate costumes and disguises are worn by both the performers and also sometimes some of the audience, who are encouraged to join in. As the players step forward and different maskers emerge and disappear, one masker who suddenly appears is a very tall and imposing figure, dressed in a sumptuously jewelled costume and wearing a mask that looks as if it's made from solid gold. Who is this tall and mysterious reveller who is dancing so artfully with the Duchess of Suffolk? Could it be Francois himself in disguise? Alas, we shall never know, because while the music continues and the lords and ladies jest and sport at their revels. It's time for us to leave the party and return to our homes in the 21st century. I do hope you've enjoyed exploring the field of the cloth of gold with me. The event is celebrating its 500th anniversary this year, and if you'd like to find out more about it, then you'll find a list of useful links in the description below the video. Meanwhile, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this time-travelling ASMR adventure, and until next time, goodbye.